So at 7 o'clock, President Paul, you're on.
Thanks very much, Paul. Good evening, everybody, to our November regular meeting. It is a pleasure to be with you all, and it is a pleasure to see so many people on, both in person and in Zoom land, as Paul likes to call it. I would be remiss in not taking a moment to recognize and send condolences to the family of Arthur Breton Smith. Brett was a continuous and huge supporter of this society and a very interested person in the history, not only of Kingston, but of the world. We send our best to the family and wish him Godspeed. The only other thing I have for tonight is to remind you that there is no meeting in December. We will return in January. Duncan will tell you at the end of the program more about the presenter. Oh, and I should mention that February being Heritage Month, we will have our Heritage event again. Planning is underway for the event to happen at the Kingston City Hall in the Memorial Hall. So with that, I'm going to get straight to the evening's event and ask Duncan to please introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Paul. My name is Duncan MacDonald, I'm the program chair, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker in a minute, Caitlin MacDonald. But by way of a general introduction, let me remind you that tourism is a major industry in the world these days. In 2022, tourism is estimated to have generated US $7.7 trillion in economic activity. 10.4% of the global GDP is generated by travel and tourism, and 9.9% of global employment is generated by travel and tourism. So this is a very important and growing sector. For most of us in our lives, tourism has become not something occasional, but something quite central to our existence. We travel for, of course, all sorts of reasons: business, hedonism, but also, I think, in line of what we're going to be talking about tonight, curiosity. And one of the major drivers here is our interest in heritage. The world is dotted now with UNESCO heritage sites. We have one right on our doorstep here in Kingston, of course. And those heritage sites are now being broadened away from physical geography into less tangible things like culture, food, music, etc. So this is very much central to the touristic experience. Another aspect of this curiosity, of course, is our interest in, well, Kat calls it the dark tourism, but the curiosity, the dark side of life, the macabre side of life. And once again, on our doorstep here in Kingston, we have an example of that with the prison tours at the old KP, which were supposed to last a year and continued to go, 4 or 5 years into it. So this is clearly an interesting topic, and that is what we are going to hear about tonight. Now, by way of introducing our speaker to you, I can tell you that Caitlin, or Kat MacDonald, is a third-year doctoral student at Queen's. She is building an academic career with a foundation in a BA at Queen's and an MA from Western in what's called public history. Most of you know what public history is, but I might remind you that is the challenge of taking history from the classroom and the library and connecting with the public. It is not an intra-academic discussion. It draws on that, but it is mainly interested in how do we present history and heritage to the broader public in museums and exhibits, in signage, etc. And so this is what her doctoral research is focused on. And it's not obviously an esoteric academic topic. It's one that, I imagine, will touch all of our consciousness when she talks about it. So without further ado, welcome.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I love your definition of public history too. That's something that we are always kind of debating on how to describe and define what that means. And I think the way you put it is great. Hey, thank you so much for everyone who's here with us today. I know it was a little crazy with the back and forth of whether we're going to be in person on Zoom, but I'm really glad that we are here in person and on Zoom to be able to talk about this. I'm very grateful to the Kingston Historical Society for inviting me here to speak to you all about dark tourism, heritage, and ghost stories. I think it's cool. I hope by the end of this, you'll also think it's really cool. So my name is Kat MacDonald, as I was introduced to you as. I am a third-year PhD candidate at the History Department at Queen's University. I'm born and raised in Kingston, so I have spent a lot of my youth and teenagehood and early adulthood being able to kind of go to all these amazing historic sites and heritage sites that we have in the city, and really getting that kind of appreciation very early on. I completed my Bachelor's of Arts honors at Queen's University with a major in history and a minor in German studies. And during that, I actually looked a lot more at military history, but I'll tell you why I kind of turned towards tourism. And it's because I loved being able to engage with the community. And I started doing that in my bachelor's. And that's kind of what made me want to pursue my degree and master's and further education in public history. And this is where kind of the love of dark tourism and tourism studies was born, because it was a way for me to be able to kind of continue that community engagement in really meaningful ways. Not that I don't love talking to other academics, I certainly do, but I also love being able to foster a passion for history with the community. And now it's kind of led me to here. So I actually do have some heritage experience as well. I work as the museum coordinator for the Museum of Ontario Archaeology in London. I'm also an advisory committee member and volunteer for Banting House National Historic Site, two museums in London that mean a lot to me and really gave me valuable experience as a heritage professional. But my favorite job I've ever had, and it's history, it's kind of like heritage adjacent, is a scare actor at Fort Fright at Fort Henry National Historic Site. And I promise it makes sense why I'm telling you about this. But all I can say is that there's nothing better than kind of getting to dress up in really cool costumes, scare the heck out of people, and do it in a historic fort and get paid to do it. I'd probably do it for free, but the pay is kind of nice. So I've kind of split my talk into two sections. The first one being, I'm going to kind of just go through some kind of basic concepts, basic definitions. There's going to be a lot of jargon, but I hate jargon. I like making what I talk about accessible as possible. And in doing so, I just want us to kind of all have that kind of same base level knowledge, some kind of playing field. And then I will show you how I kind of trace that and talk about it in my project and using more like examples to show you how this works. Did I do something wrong?
No, I'm trying to get rid of that bar and I can't. It's supposed to be up at the top and it's not. No, you keep talking.
It's the
Talk
ghost.
about
We can just blame the ghost.
Yeah, it's just you lost your first point there.
We'll see it because it's called Conjuring Specters. Hard to miss. Oh, not to.
It did it by
It's
itself.
the spirits. They're
The
working with
spirits work.
us today.
I threatened them. Sorry to interrupt.
So this is a photo that I took myself, and I'll just make note right here that all the photos that you see, I took myself on my various kind of tours and takings of all the events in Kingston. Part of the larger project that's kind of outside my dissertation is to be able to kind of photograph and visualize these sites that I'm talking about. So this is on top of Fort Henry Hill. It's overlooking RMC, and I was actually taken right before I took a haunted walk of the ghosts of Fort Henry with the Haunted Walks of Kingston. And the reason I kind of show you this picture, I tell you that I'm a scare actor, is because I feel like there's no better way for me to kind of talk about what I do than to kind of open with a ghost story. So I have two to share with you today. So the first is my time as a scare actor at Fort Fright at Fort Henry. And it was a great night. It was kind of a slow night. And, you know, after screaming at people for 3 hours, I was getting a little thirsty, need to get off my feet for a bit. So I went into the staff room and I was sitting down just having my water. And that's when I heard these really loud footsteps above me. And I'm not immediately thinking it's any kind of ghost, despite everyone, all my coworkers believing that we call him the party ghost. Don't know how he got the name, but apparently he haunts the women's like change room. And I thought it might have been a supervisor above me, could be another scare actor. Honestly, could have been a guest that kind of just wandered into this area. So I got up and went into the room that kind of connects the two change rooms where the staircase is to get upstairs. And I'm just calling out like, hey, is anyone there? And there's no answer. So I go back, I'm thinking maybe they didn't hear me, maybe they don't want to talk, whatever. I'm not thinking ghost at first until I hear them again. And then I really kind of start to think. And I'm like, well, you know, if it's supervisor, the supervisor probably would have said something to me, probably called out and like, hey, don't worry, it's just me. Scare actors weren't allowed up there because they're currently doing restoration process on that section where the staff rooms are. We were only allowed to go up there to get walkies, and that's at the beginning of our shift. There's no other scare actors in here. Again, they probably would have said, hey, it's just me. And because of this restoration, it is blocked off for guests to just kind of accidentally wander over into that section. I decided that, you know, as much as I love scaring people, I do not like being scared myself. That was it for my break, and I was back to my position. And the other experience that I had kind of came a couple nights after that. And in my section, I was a witch. And how it's kind of set up for Fort Bright is that there's a path that you take for the people kind of in this immersive experience. And then there's another road that is kind of on the outside of the main path. And that's where maintenance workers can kind of get to positions that they need to very quickly. It's how we can get back to our positions without kind of ruining the immersive experience for guests by trying to squeeze around them. And I kept hearing these footsteps behind me because I was facing inwardly to the path where the guests were. Again, didn't think of anything of it. Could be a maintenance worker, could be another scare actor, could be supervisor, could be the audio that is playing in my area. The audio that was playing was like a girl kind of out of breath, kind of like very scared. I'm like, she's probably running. Until I was talking to a friend after one shift, and she said, I kept hearing these footsteps behind me on the maintenance road. I'm like, well, you know, it's probably just the audio, but we don't have the same audio. And I'm like, oh. And it could have been a maintenance worker, but where my vision of the maintenance road, I could see if I kind of like peered around, I could see both ways, whether it was a maintenance worker. I would either see them walking towards me or walking away from me, unless they were very, very fast. But I say all these to not try to convince you that ghosts are real. I'm not here to make a believer out of you, but it reminded me of when I took this tour here of the ghosts of Fort Henry, and they told us about how lots of guests would say that they kind of hear these voices in the dry ditch. They hear these footsteps in the dry ditch, and perhaps that is what I'm hearing. So if I'm not here to make a believer out of you, what am I here to do? I want us to kind of think about maybe a ghost story that we heard of Kingston. Maybe it's a personal experience. And I want you to just kind of think about it for a second. And as we go through all these topics, maybe this is a way that we can start to unpack that ghost story and offer new ways to look at historical analysis and the historical inquiry process. So, Conjuring Spectre, we have a beautiful picture of Kingston Penitentiary's North Gate here. And here are just a brief, quick rundown of some of the definitions that I will be going through. So the first is dark tourism. Dark tourism refers to the profiting off of or tourism that is directed towards sites of death, suffering, tragedy, massacre, and murder. We'll go into much more detail about this later, but some of the sites you can kind of think about that fall into this definition: the 9/11 Memorial Museum, you can think about Chernobyl, and you can think about the Cambodian Genocide Museum. The second concept I had is haunting. So there's two ways I kind of refer to this. The first refers to the ways in which social forms of the past emerge in our present. This conceptualization of haunting for me is grounded in theories by Homi Bhabha and Martin Hudson, who I'll also talk about later. But it also can refer to the actual kind of haunting of that ghost story that I just told you. Specters, the ones who are doing the haunting, refers to the literal social forms of the past, if we're talking in this academic sense as Hudson is. But it can also refer to the actual ghost in that ghost story, the party ghost, if we want to continue to call him that, who is perhaps doing some loud footsteps above me on my break. Sites of pain refers to just sites where death, tragedy, or pain have occurred. This is a term that I have started to use more in my project, and it's a term I collaborated on with my supervisor, Professor Caroline Isabel-Caron. And I will explain more why I use this often more than I use dark tourism when describing my research, but it just reflects a more broader term that I like to use. And we'll talk about moral and ethical questions of maybe why we shouldn't call things dark tourism. My last point here is tourist narratives. This refers to the kinds of narratives that are crafted, conjured, and tailored about a heritage site or a historic site by organizations, institutions, etc. These narratives specifically of sites of pain are not bound by any kind of physical space. These narratives are found in brochures and marketing materials, on social media posts. They're also found in when I go to take a tour and then I go and tell my family about it, that I'm spreading kind of that narrative. So they're not bound by any kind of physical space or place. The other part of it is a tourist script. And this tourist script is also kind of broken down into two parts. The physical script, like I have here of my speech tonight, that is written down, that has been researched, that has been recorded, that is used to then further train guides to give tours. The other part of that script is that when you go take a tour, your guide's probably not reading word for word off a piece of paper, unless they're training. Oftentimes, they're going to take kind of the main concept, main big points of the script, and they'll add things. They'll add little stories or personal experiences, or they might hear a question that a guest has asked them and then kind of tailor some of the stories that they are aware of to fit that group. And I like to think that's what a good tour guide can do, is be able to be entertaining and engaging in that way. But that's also part of that narrative. It's a very, I can read a script hundreds of times. That writing is never changing. But when I take a tour, that tour is going to be sometimes be different from when I took it a week ago, when I take it the next day. It just kind of depends on who the guide is. That's why I kind of break it down into those two parts. Darkness on the edge of town. That is a picture of the Frontenac County Courthouse. So dark tourism, finally, what my talk is about today. I will now talk about this kind of the field of study, how it kind of started, and how we as historians can kind of use this concept to better our understanding of history. So this is a term that's coined in 1996 by scholars John Lennon and Malcolm Foley in their pivotal work, Dark Tourism, the Attraction of Death and Disaster. They originally wrote an article a year before they wrote this book, and they're actually looking at the JFK assassination site and why people are fascinated with visiting this site. And it's through that research that they decide to write this book. Their work opened with a discussion on humanity's fascination with this death, with tragedy, with this weird, morbid curiosity of why are people visiting sites where this awful, tragic history has happened. And they proposed this concept of dark tourism. And the way they're framing it is both the presentation of this history, but also the consumption of this history. So it's kind of a two-way street to some degree. And the reason this is working in this way is because these sites, this history, is kind of putting anxiety, it's positing anxiety in the project that is modernity. And because of how they kind of framed this, with it being anxiety in the project of modernity, they kind of put the boundaries of what can make a dark tourist site within what's called living memory. So within the last 150 years. And now you may be thinking, if you've ever gone to the UK and taking a tour of ghost tour of one of the gallows, well, that's more than like 100 years ago. And there's other definitions that kind of talk about the same fascination. One is A.B. Seaton's understanding, that is thanatourism or death tourism. But unlike Foley and Lennon, who are looking at this presentation and consumption, he's looking at historicizing this, which is where those kind of older sites are kind of falling more perhaps into what he's looking at. But dark tourism is what we're here to talk about. Since their groundbreaking work, this has been a huge booming field of study. It's also been very interesting for the public's reaction. The public seems also equally as interested in this field of study. My notes are out of order. I'm so sorry, my notes are very out of order. So many scholars who are looking at this are looking at the way sites are consumed by the public, the way institutions and organizations present this history to the public. There's actually even an entire research institute in the UK dedicated to dark tourism scholarship and the production of that dark tourism scholarship. So, but even though it's a booming field, it's also kind of unstable. And I always want to acknowledge that vagueness of the term dark tourism. If I were giving you that definition, a lot of sites can kind of fall into that. So lots of scholars have also said that it's posing an issue. Like when I say the word dark, what am I implying by that? Why do I get to decide what's dark? What does dark actually mean in this case? Is there not a layer of some kind of ethical or moral implication that I'm giving to a site or to an organization by putting this label on them. And this is kind of where I'm using the term sites of pain instead, is to kind of move away from that moral and ethical question. There's lots of people who are researching this. I am not one of them. But the other side of that is that because it's such a new field, there wasn't a lot of frameworks and theories that were guiding this early research. So this is why it's also kind of a little bit of an unstable field in term. So Dr. Philip Stone and Richard Sharpley are two notable dark tourism scholars who kind of saw this need to recognize that dark is an unhelpful term and dark tourism can be an unhelpful term, and put forth some kind of way that we can look at these sites. So they create what is called a typology of death. Ways that we can talk about these sites in some kind of boundaried way. And one such way that they propose is called the shades of tourism. And I have my little graph up there of the shades of tourism. So some such tensions, so when you put a site on this spectrum, what you start to reveal is tensions that arise from the site, from that consumption, from that presentation. And some of these tensions include like issues of revitalization, issues of interpretation and reinterpretation. There is still some level of that moral and ethical question, and revitalization. So visually, this is the shades of tourism. On one side, you have the lightest side, which is often called pale tourism, or just the lightest, or pale. And on the other side, you have something called black tourism, the darkest, or just black. And the hope is that you can kind of put sites onto the spectrum of some kind and start to get those conversations about revitalization, interpretation, and such. So the black side is typically referred to for sites of death and suffering that have a very high political influence. In comparison, that very light side of the spectrum is characterized as sites kind of associated with death and suffering and that kind of have like a low political influence. Two ways that I like to think about it is that on the light side, or perhaps things like cemeteries, you're going there with a very distinct purpose, and it just kind of happens to be associated with that death. Where versus a side like the dark, you might put something like Chernobyl, taking a tour to one of the reactors. And then you can start to kind of see why are these companies even allowing tourists to come to these reactors? Is there this level of, and then we start to talk about entertainment versus kind of education. So Stone states when we're talking about the spectrum is, it's a fluid and dynamic continuum of intensity, which is anchored by various, though not necessarily exclusive, product features and characteristics. The biggest issue sometimes is that a lot of us are not going to agree where these sites fall. A lot of people would never agree with me where I put cemeteries versus where I've put Chernobyl. So it can be maybe viewed as unhelpful, but I think that even starting that conversation by putting these sites on that spectrum is helpful. We'll open up that conversation to have this discussion, right? The other typology that they come out with is the 7 dark suppliers. I could probably have a whole talk just on the 7 types of dark suppliers, but the one that I want to talk to you about today is something called dark dungeons. So this is another way to kind of characterize a site so that we can better analyze and discuss it. So as Stone defines, dark dungeons are bygone penal sites that present this history through educational and entertaining means to a present day consumer. For those of us who are from Kingston and maybe have taken one of the tours, when I hear that, I think of Kingston Penitentiary. It fits kind of relatively neatly into that definition of a dark dungeon. It's a former prison with entertaining and educational presentations of history for us, the present day consumer. Now, I've shared a lot of thoughts about what dark tourism is. I've thrown a lot of information at you. And I've also talked a lot more about tourism and tourism studies than I kind of have about history. So is dark tourism, the study of it, is it applicable to historians? Like, what is the role of a historian when looking at this? And that's a question I get asked a lot doing this kind of research. So the study of dark tourism and the issues that arise from it are not mutually exclusive to any field. There's a lot of psychologists who are actually looking at dark tourism to try and pinpoint where this fascination of this morbid curiosity is coming from. And a lot of these sites are dealing with history. So I feel like naturally we already kind of have our foot in the door as historians. A lot of people, the reason they're going to these sites is that there is an attraction to this history of some kind. And that's where I think we can start to get our foot in the door and be able to discuss it. So the role of the historian, the issue of dark tourism is one that comes up a lot more in public history. So kind of where I got my background from. We as public historians are trained to work with the community to research and disseminate the history that we've collaborated on. And a lot of times what happens is that there's a lot of contentious or controversial, very complex, multifaceted history that we're trying to navigate. So that's how a role as a public historian, but even any historian who's interested in that kind of history can kind of start to talk about it. And similar to Seton, who's seeking to historicize this phenomenon of fan tourism, dark tourism, my aim in researching this phenomenon is to highlight the historical component as actually a very important component of this dark tourism, of this phenomenon. So that's kind of how we can kind of get our foot in the door. And I think anybody who looks at heritage or looks at any kind of historic site can use these frameworks to perhaps start opening up conversations in history and offer new and interdisciplinary ways to kind of expand how we talk about it and not just the traditional academic sense. So I've talked to you about dark tourism, but I feel like I haven't delivered yet on the haunted part, on the ghost part. So I will now talk to you about hauntings and specters. So as I mentioned, a lot of my conceptualization, my understanding of haunting and specters comes from post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha's understanding and sociologist Martin Hudson's kind of understanding of these social pasts kind of emerging into our present. And I really like the way that Hudson talks about and refers to it as like a social haunting. So in this way, this is where I'm going to start talking with my hands a lot. This haunting is happening on our peripherals. It's always kind of there. And sometimes it presents itself right in front of us. And sometimes we confront it. So if you never drive by the penitentiary, if you never kind of take that tour, it's just kind of on your peripherals. You're like, yeah, I know it's there. I know it's there. I know it exists, but I'm not confronting it. And I talk about the penitentiary a lot because I know the most about it right now. And it's kind of the big draw for all of this research. But the history of the penitentiary does haunt Kingston. As every time we kind of drive by it, every time we take a tour, this social form of the past is kind of emerging back into our present. Even more so, as you take the tour and listen to the guide, recount stories of the daily life of those who are incarcerated, tell you, as you're walking through the cells, your mind might start to imagine what was happening here as they point to like pictures of one of the riots. But there's no actual bodies on display. There's no person that's actually sitting in that cell who's in the shops area. It's your kind of mind who's putting this imagined body back on display. And that's kind of who I'm referring to when I talk about specters. It's these people who, through these narratives, are being continually evoked and conjured for us. And they're part of that history that kind of socially haunts us. So what's the benefit of this approach? Academically speaking, this is a really cool new angle and a new way for us to kind of start to understand complex histories. And I think it's especially important for those of us who look at heritage and tourism. Lots of tourism historians are looking at ways that identity is formed and reproduced through tourist narratives, but less so are looking at the ways that ghost stories and hauntings and these kind of offerings of ghost tours are kind of doing the same thing. What do hauntings then reveal about history? Non-academically speaking, I like to think of them as gateways to history. These are ways to encourage and foster people who may not think that they like history into perhaps being like, oh yeah, I like history. Best way I can think about it is if we think about the ghost stories that are told about Skeleton Park, McBurney Park in the downtown core in Kingston. When you start to hear those stories, you can start to pick apart some of the specters, some of the characters of the stories and be like, well, it tells us that there's a mass burial here, Irish immigrants, okay? We learn then about immigration to Kingston, we learn about disease, we learn about how we care for our dead, and how we care for our dead in terms of public health crises. So these are ways we can start to kind of pick these stories apart and kind of encourage and engage and foster this love of history, and especially I think the future generations of historians. Now from my project itself. This is a photo of the Prince George Hotel, which currently holds the office for the Haunted Walks of Kingston. So the project I'm talking to you about today is just generally called kind of Spectres of the Limestone City. But I'm going to briefly talk about my dissertation because I never get to gab about it too much and I like doing so. So the project itself, the full dissertation title, which is a little too academic for a talk like this, but I want to give it to you anyway, is called Spectres of the Limestone City, Tourist Narratives in Contemporary Kingston, Ontario. And the reason I kind of started on this kind of path for this project is when I was the first month I was entering my public history master's at Western, Kingston Penitentiary announces that they're holding a rock concert called Rock in the Big House. And it was to raise money for the United Way of KFLNA. And I just passively was kind of following these conversations on like when you could still post like news articles on Facebook. It's kind of in the comments, just kind of watching how people were reacting to this. And I saw two sides. Some people were like, this is so cool. I've always wanted this is like a really cool opportunity to get to go into the penitentiary and like listen to really good music. And the other side is like, why are we doing this? Why are we holding a rock concert in a place that has such a history of pain? And and it wasn't just from academics who are saying this in the comments. It's some people like community members, the public who is also like, we should be recognizing kind of this long history of pain that's happening here. And I'm like, this is really interesting, this rise in tensions between what is being presented and then also what is being consumed. I'm like, I wonder if I could write a dissertation about this. I also have always loved ghost stories ever since I was a little kid. My parents can attest to that. Anytime you had to write a speech in elementary school, I was always writing about urban legends, folktales, and ghost stories. And one year was even about ghost stories in Kingston. And I never thought I could be able to kind of do both, my love of history and ghost stories. I always thought of them as two kind of separate things that I just kind of have to love separately until I entered my PhD at Queen's, and people were like, no, like this is really cool. Like you should definitely write your dissertation on this. And so here I am. So I'm looking at tourist narratives in Kingston. So my dissertation is kind of interrogating these narratives and is hoping to answer two particular questions. So what type of history of Kingston is being told in these narratives? And how do these narratives and stories work? The newest concept I'm kind of playing around with is Kingston as a heritage site itself. The sites that I've been talking to you about and will continue to mention, you could look at them in detail by themselves. You could understand how those narratives and stories are successful and how they work. But the history of all these sites are so naturally intertwined with each other that you can't really look at them in a vacuum. They're not operating in a vacuum, kind of isolated by themselves. It's when these sites are put into conversation with each other that the story of Kingston, the story of Kingston is revealed. They're all kind of working together to craft an overarching tale of some kind to tell the story that is Kingston. And so that's why I'm thinking, I like the idea of these sites are kind of gears in a machine that is the heritage city of Kingston, Kingston as a heritage city. So I will mention now, because I get a lot of questions about this, usually in the question and answer period. This work is not concerned with questions of morality or ethics or any kind of financial question. I do take into consideration in those, but as I see the project now, as I do this history, I don't feel that that is kind of what my aim or goal of this project kind of is. Not to say they're not important, they are. Just what I'm looking at is just, I really like to look at and I'm fascinated with how these narratives are kind of working, kind of studying the script as a piece of literature and finding the discourse within those scripts. So my scope of the project, I'm looking at Kingston, Ontario. Why? I'm from here. I like the history, and I think that's a good enough reason to probably study it. But I also think that Kingston is very interesting in the way that it does operate as a heritage site itself. It's also said to be one of the most haunted cities in Kingston. So I think that adds a really cool level to look at all that kind of ghosts and ghost stories and that tourism. And Kingston recognizes how important tourism and history is to itself when we just hear the slogan where history and innovation thrive. Well, Kingston is haunted by the very history that kind of thrives here. And I'm kind of looking at it with the city's past is on its peripherals, being haunted by the history on its peripherals. And it's the narrative that is delivered to tourists and the community that's kind of story of Kingston. Even more interestingly is how these places develop from former institutions into tourist sites, and how that has influenced the community's understanding of itself, of the city, and Kingston's place in broader kind of Canadian understanding of history. So at the moment, I'm looking at sites like Kingston Penitentiary, of course, Rockwood Asylum, Fort Henry, Skeleton Park / McBurney Park, the Frontenac County Courthouse, and I'm sure as I research more, others will pop up, but these are kind of the main ones that have the most information kind of out there about them, and the ones that are working together the most to kind of craft this story. This is not a comparative project. It's really interesting to actually compare things like Kingston Penitentiary to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, but that's a whole nother like 400-page dissertation that I could do. I just do not have the space to be able to do that. I think by doing a case study on kind of Kingston specifically, you're able to dig much deeper and do a much deeper analysis of the city. My early research. So the picture there is from Pumpkin Inferno that was held at the penitentiary just this past kind of late September, October. That is a picture of a wizard casting his magic in pumpkins over one of the guard towers. So this past summer, I spent a lot of my time taking tours and attending events that are offered at many of these sites. I had kind of my little checklist of places that I kind of wanted to check out, and which was in collaboration with my supervisor. And at the beginning of August, when I was attending my tour at the penitentiary, we were led to one of the shop areas, and I saw all these pumpkins on the ground. And I had no idea what to think of them. I didn't know what was happening. I was kind of like, just stay on track. You gotta listen to what the guide's telling you. It wasn't until one of the other people in the group kind of asked, like, what are all these pumpkins doing here? And our guide said, don't tell anybody, but the penitentiary is going to be hosting Pumpkin Inferno. That's very hard for a historian not to want to go back and be like, guys, guess what? Guess what's happening at the penitentiary? But I kept my word, and I did keep that secret. I was both surprised, but not shocked that this was happening. As a scare actor, I was already asked back to go work at Fort Fright. So I knew that the Pumpkin Inferno, which had been previously held at Fort Henry for 2 years, was not happening there. They couldn't offer both of these attractions at once. But I was shocked that it was happening at the penitentiary. I thought that if they might do some kind of on and off again kind of rotation of Fort Fright and Pumpkin Inferno, I never in a million years thought it would be held at the penitentiary. At the top of my slide here, you can read one of the kind of advertisement slogans that they used on their Facebook, which is immerse yourself in the enchanting worlds of glowing pumpkins. And I kind of want to question what narratives surround an event like this. They're promoting the event as family-friendly, kind of fun, magical, wondrous, this magical world, which it is. If you've ever taken the version of it at Upper Canada Village, it is quite magical and quite fun. But evidently, they don't mention history of the penitentiary in any of those advertisements. Maybe it would come off across as poor taste, or maybe even contradictory to what they are trying to kind of sell and promote here. So I took the tour on the second night it was open, mainly because I had to work Fort Fright the night before for opening night. But I had a really interesting experience when I was entering the attraction. So you're led through the north gate to kind of go into the larger area where they have all the pumpkins set up outside. As I was walking through, I recognized one of the workers. It was a former guard who I had previously heard from my tour earlier in August. And he kind of turns to another worker and says, new lot of inmates coming in. And immediately the tone felt really weird to me that was said to me, which I understand perhaps why he said that. It was just kind of off as I'm going to try and distance myself and understand why we're having this magical world of pumpkins. You know, as a heritage professional who works at museums, I understand the need for diverse offerings. We're always trying to get more people through the door to prove to whomever that you need money to upkeep these sites, to employ the community. You need to offer these diverse experiences. But I want to question whose voices are being left out when we offer these experiences. not just in kind of this planning and preparation process, but also in the larger narrative of this place. Finally, what I'm seeing early on in this research is the importance of interpretation, reinterpretation, and navigation. Many places may not even know where to begin with this, but the community is actively calling for some kind of recognition. I remember seeing in some of the Facebook comments, people saying, well, I'll never visit Pumpkin Inferno here. I never want to like associate this kind of magical world with artistically carved pumpkins and what happened at the penitentiary. So we kind of need to start having these open conversations about how do we start to navigate this, because it's already happening in the comment section of these advertisements. So I have another picture. It's a steampunk kind of exhibit part of Pumpkin Inferno, where they say, get ready for a spooktacular evening at Kingston Penitentiary. The next one was a superhero exhibit. And the caption I've kind of pulled from there, it's an experience that promised to captivate and delight. Some of the other events I kind of look at are Fort Fright and the movie night that they also hold at Kingston Penitentiary. They kind of all fall somewhere on that spectrum of shades of tourism. But I want to question how these events operate within the narratives that are already present at this site. You know, when I hear Enchanting World of Pumpkins, I don't necessarily think of a former penal institution. Even the way, again, this is described in the marketing with words like spooktacular and delight and magical. I just want to start to question why we're describing it in this way. Perhaps there's other ways we can kind of navigate this. But I will just say it is a fun event. I did enjoy it, but I had a hard time as a researcher being able to distance myself from the history that I'm aware of, the pain that I am aware of at these sites, knowing whose voices are already left out of these conversations and being able to actually kind of enjoy the artistic creations that were there. So holding a rock concert at a penitentiary, obviously, yeah, it draws crowds. But does the crowd know kind of where they're walking, the history that has taken place here? Do they need to know? Should they know? I mean, I would argue, yes. I'd hope they would care and I'd hope they would know. But I will tell you, I don't have all the answers, and I'm sure we won't have all the answers by the time we're finished this talk either. But my main thing is, I think the first step is just to kind of start talking about it openly, acknowledging that there are narratives that are leaving voices out, and then, okay, we recognize this, acknowledge this, where can we maybe together go on from here? So as I mentioned, I take a lot of the tours, which is a very interesting way to kind of research this. A lot of my cohort is looking at things in the archives, but I'm here spending a lot of time and a lot of money on taking all these tours and attending these events. And I kind of want to talk about briefly why that's the case. So why take the tours? Well, as I told you, I can't just look at the script and know exactly kind of what's happening on this tour. I have to take the tour, and I have to take the tour multiple times to get that full experience. I'm not saying that I will not do any archival work. I have to. I'll need some kind of supplementary information to be able to really analyze these sites. But I think taking the tours is a fun, very fun, and engaging way to also kind of start to connect and network with the community. I experience new things on these tours all the time. Those little tidbits of information, if I had just looked at signage of Pumpkin Inferno, I would have never had a guard tell me that I was a new inmate kind of coming into the pen, which I think is a very interesting point that I would love to be able to discuss further in my dissertation. So as I've talked about, my work is intentionally interdisciplinary. And this is not to say that a law historian's work isn't, but I really want to make that effort. I've talked a lot about sociology and tourism studies, but I also look at anthropology, which is something I never thought I would do. I'm also looking at English and literature studies and kind of Gothic studies and the ways that I can use these frameworks to better understand the history and better analyze the history that I am looking at. I love community engagement and community encouragement like here today. I network with community partners and organizations. I have a great working relationship right now with the Haunted Walks, who have kindly offered copies of their tour scripts so that I can do this research. And I want to continue that because the goal and hope for this is that this research that I do is beneficial to them. I'd be happy to kind of pass it along to them and say, hey, let's sit down, let's work on this together. So I'd love being able to network and make these kind of community engagement relationships. I think archival work is important. Obviously, as a historian, I need it as my basis, but I like looking at things called history outside the text and how people and objects are just as interesting ways to learn history than, you know, like a letter or a journal or a diary. And in saying this, I recognize there are, of course, issues with taking tours from and kind of writing it down from my memory or using just objects to kind of study history. But text is not without any kind of faults either. And I think recognizing that text isn't the only way to kind of study and look at history only helps us, makes us better historians. And lastly, which I hope I did today, my approach to this project is to make it accessible. This comes from my public history background. I strive to have my work accessible to the public. Yes, I'm writing this dissertation, and of course, academics are going to read it, but I hope the public will get to read it too, and I can write it in a way that it's beneficial to them, it's interesting to them as well. History should be accessible to everyone, and I really stand kind of by that. As any good story, are we at the end? Almost, I promise. One of the biggest questions that we get as historians is like, so what? Who cares? Why should I care about this? If I haven't already answered that for you, I hope these next couple slides will kind of answer that for yourself. The biggest reason to care is that it's not just me as one academic that is calling for these sites to recognize what is happening here. It is the public as well. And we want to encourage the public to be engaging with history and perhaps even engaging critically with history. From the people I've talked to seeing all these comments on these advertisements, the public is calling for narratives to be reinterpreted. This dissertation is producing and will continue to produce very tangible outcomes. And I'm very excited that hopefully these will be able to be used by the organizations who I've made this working relationship with, and perhaps places in other cities who are interested in also kind of navigating complex histories. Studies of this kind are cutting edge, especially with dark tourism kind of being as new as it is. Heritage and tourism are hot topics at the moment, and this work is quite timely with many organizations trying to kind of grapple with the history that surrounds their sites. I also offer that I think there's value in non-traditional approaches to history. I get told a lot that what I'm doing isn't history, but I would strongly disagree. It's that history outside the text and recognizing the value of non-traditional sources, once again, just kind of make us better historians. I'm probably biased in saying this, but it's cool. And I think that's a very valid reason that people should care, because I think ghosts are cool. So my next steps for this project, and most importantly dissertation, is the archival work, kind of getting to dig through those archives, taking more tours. And now that I have some of the scripts, I can start to do that literary and discourse analysis. I hope to continue to make these engage with the community and make more working relationships, specifically with the Kingston designation group who runs the trolley tours, and St. Lawrence Parks Commission who operates the tours at the penitentiary. I'm lucky enough to have been given some of the access to scripts by the haunted blocks, but I would love access to more of the scripts to be able to kind of do this research. And of course, lots of writing, the easy part of writing the dissertation, lots of writing and rewriting and rewriting. But this project expands beyond my dissertation. And after I defend this work, I hope I can turn this into a book and perhaps even some kind of job opportunity where I can work with institutions, historic sites, heritage sites in Kingston, outside of Kingston, kind of navigating and reinterpreting these narratives. So if you remember anything of all the information I kind of rambled on to you for the past while, first, hauntings and ghost stories offer a new way to think about history. Whether it's looking at the ways people have passed down history and communicated information through urban legends, folktales, and ghost stories, or how we can use these stories as a ways to question narrative and identity, we have an exciting opportunity to kind of embrace this form. Secondly, historical analysis benefits from taking an interdisciplinary approach. This is not to say one has to do so, but just kind of go and read other kind of books outside your field. You never know what you may be able to learn from that. Thirdly, there are rising tensions in our community to this day about a site's history and the commodification of that site, of that history. Balance is needed. I understand we want to offer kind of cool and exciting new events, but we also need to recognize what kind of narratives we are producing when we offer kind of set events. And lastly, ghost stories are gateways to learn more about and connect with the past. As we look forward to the future and desire to inspire future generations of historians, public historians, and heritage professionals, connecting with them through an accessible means like a ghost story is a great way to start. They're fun, they're exciting, and they always pique people's interest and can help us learn more about the process of historical inquiry. I want to thank everyone for listening to me ramble on about all of this. I love being able to talk more about this, and I'm always happy to kind of engage and network more so that we can kind of start to open this conversation ourselves. So feel free to email me at katmariemacdonald@gmail.com. You can visit my website to learn more about kind of the work I'm doing and the work I'm doing outside of this dissertation at katmacdonaldhistorian.wordpress.com. You can follow me on X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram to see some of those photos that I'm taking, and just we can chat. And these next few slides are just a selected bibliography that I have. So thank you so much for everyone who joined us today in person and on Zoom, for listening to me talk, and thank you to the Kingston Historical Society for inviting me to have the chance to be able to talk about this.
Well, thank you. As an old historian, I'm impressed with your mid-doctoral research enthusiasm. It's a wonderful period in your life, and you conveyed that very nicely to us. We're going to go into questions now, and do we have any in the live or Zoom audiences?
Folks are going to get tired of hearing about it, but it's, as you know, I'm into the American Civil War, big way. I've been to Gettysburg about 200 times and talk about ghost stories and the ghost walks. And I've been all over the US. Gettysburg's got to be the highlight of ghost walks in North America, perhaps. And I wondered if there was any relationship that is between what's going on at Gettysburg and what we're trying to do here, because we're doing a great job. I've been on the Ghost Walk. I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it. I don't remember who the guide was, but whoever it was, it was great.
Great storytellers.
And you know, I immediately was thinking of, boy, try Gettysburg, folks. So part of your dissertation should be a tour of Gettysburg and its ghost walks. Study them too.
Probably won't have, I mean, again, you could probably do a whole dissertation on Gettysburg.
Yeah.
I haven't been to Gettysburg personally, but I know that I want to go to Galveston, Texas. There's a lot of, again, it's known to be a very haunted place. They call it a dark tourist spot due to some of the tragedy that has happened there. I want to take those tours more for my own personal enjoyment and my own personal kind of, I guess, kind of the bigger project that I'm doing. Is taking tours in other places. I would love to go to Eastern State Penitentiary and really see, because it's really interesting how the Kingston Penitentiary and Eastern State Penitentiary were kind of followed very similar paths, but I believe that they are offering ghost tours currently, well, not this month, but especially leading into the month of Halloween, ghost tours at Eastern State Penitentiary. So it'd be interesting to see if Kingston Penitentiary would ever further develop like they had. So, I mean, I just want to do it because I think it's cool. And I'd love to go to Gettysburg and take a ghost tour.
Questions? Well, maybe I could ask you a question. Listening to your typology, it struck me that probably the darkest site of tourism in Canada in the last 2 years has been the graveyards of the residential schools. We don't visit them much, but they're in our consciousness as a kind of place of darkness. But listening to you and the need for balance, what strikes me about the residential cemeteries is it's become an all-conquering kind of narrative that has pushed aside any other interpretation of that site. I'm not saying it's not real, but here in Kingston, we're very conscious that MacDonald's reputation has suffered terribly because of this dark tourist image, even though he wasn't, in fact, the author of the Indian Act, etc. So it seems to me you're unleashing some very powerful genies here, and
Conjuring some powerful spirits.
yeah. and you said it, and I understand it, that you don't want to go near the morality or the ethical dimensions of it. But it seems to me that's implicit in this industry. We live in a world, a very credulous world that is full of conspiracy theses and stuff that really doesn't make any sense. And you're not going there, but plenty of people could take what you're saying and do just that.
Yeah. Funny enough, every time I talk about this, I always get asked about Indigenous burial grounds, and I don't know what kind of causes people to think of that first. As a settler, I don't feel it's my place to kind of ever question that. I like to be very comfortable I understand there's always a level of financial, moral, and ethical kind of implications that are placed on what I'm studying. But as a historian, whatever, objective truth I'm trying to find in my research, I'm very comfortable just kind of knowing my place as a historian and as a settler on this land. There is actually someone who is doing dark tourism, I believe, within some kind of Indigenous understanding. I believe they're out west, and I wish I remembered their name, because someone is already looking at dark tourism at residential schools in Canada, which I'm really fascinated to follow that kind of academic career that they're having. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm just suggesting that, we in traditional history, if you like to call it that, have a kind of implicit ethical code, footnotes, prove it is in my footnotes, and that is lacking here. I mean, because you're drawing off a kind of more amorphous world that has a reality. I mean, we all act on it, but just the kind of give me proof side of me keeps emerging, and I'm sure some of these haunted walks are very good. We used to live in Ottawa on the edge of the canal, and the canal boat would go by every hour, and we were walking the dogs, and you'd overhear the person often saying the most outrageous things about Ottawa. And given that most of the people knew nothing about it, I suppose they took it in. That's what worries me about it. And I'm sure there's lots of responsible people saying, get your narrative right. Anyway, that's my.
I mean, it's like I said in my talk, it's so weird to shuffle like this. Like I said in my talk, it's very multifaceted and complex. And at this point in my dissertation, I certainly don't have all the answers. And perhaps if I were to present this kind of a year from now, I might say something differently. But I like that about the historical kind of research process too. And then I'm open to change and to kind of changing what I believed earlier. So that's why I like history too.
Thanks. Questions? Please.
Unfortunately, the other mic doesn't work. It's okay. I'll be very quick with this one.
First, a little bit of context. I am not a settler. I was born here, and I take offense to that. And I don't mean to be rude or anything, but I think this has to stop. Now, where I'm going to go with this is a little bit of context. I attended McGill University, fell in love with a woman, moved to Sudbury, started a paranormal show at CKLU, which is Laurentian University. And in that show, I had many guests on. And when we moved to Kingston, I had a woman on by the name of Erin. Now, Erin is a clairvoyant. She claims to have channeled Sir John A. MacDonald. So when I put that show together, I did a lot of history on Sir John A. MacDonald, things I didn't know. Some fascinating, funny stories. I'll give you one. When he'd go down to the Royal Tavern here in Kingston, and I didn't know this is just from pure research and talking with Erin. He used to take a boat by hands. Now, here's the deal with that. He used to buy them all a beer. So, I would have voted twice for him. So there you go. The other thing that we talked about that I didn't know, that his son, I think it was his son, fell down a flight of stairs at his home that's over on, I forget the name of the street. When I went into that house as a host of this show here in Kingston, because we're here in Kingston now, show's called Night Fright. You can find it easily on YouTube, and I don't make any money off it. It's purely a volunteer show. One of the things that I asked them if it would be possible to do an interview with one of the people that I guess, act as a tour guide, if you will, and particularly on ghosts. And they said, no, they don't want to be associated with anything about ghosts. And I thought, well, this is a great opportunity to get it out to, I have 15, 16,000 subscribers across the world. This would be a great opportunity to get Kingston on the map. And they just right away. Now, the trolley tours you had mentioned, I had gone down and made a presentation about haunted trolley tours. They took the idea and ran with it. And I got left out. The same with the penitentiary. I made a big presentation on the penitentiary because I had spent a full day at Alcatraz and I had a wonderful time there. My ex-wife, not so much. That's not why she's not my ex-wife, but I'm just saying she was not impressed with the 7 hours I spent there. But what I took away from the Alcatraz tours, I said, we can do this at the penitentiary. And they did. So I'm grateful for that. One of the things I know that is always morally in jeopardy with ghost tours and things of that nature. I had Michelle Desrochers on the show. She used to run the haunted tours at Castle Loma. She's also a demonologist, and I mentioned that because I'm going to tell you a little spooky story after to leave you with. But I asked Michelle, I said, Michelle, would it be possible to do a seance at the site of 9/11? Well, of course not. I mean, that would really be disgusting. However, there was no bodies, as you say, at the penitentiary. There was no murders at the penitentiary. Sorry, there was no hangings at the penitentiary. There was no capital punishment. It was the worst of the worst, and I've done shows on serial killers as well, and these guys are bad news. One of the things I presented was the fact that people have a morbid curiosity about serial killers. I mean, there's tons of shows on television. So this would be a big money maker. And that's what this comes down to. How do you define what is entertainment and what is exploitation? And this is something we've all been grappling with. I write music for horror films and all kinds of stuff. So like you, I've had horror in my life, my whole life, including my ex-wife. Okay, that's a joke. And I guess that what I'm trying to say is there is a marketing capability right here in Kingston that we can take advantage of, especially now. People come to Fort Henry, people can come see the boat now, and I suggest that they have haunted tours on that boat. And the other thing I would recommend on the boat is people being able to stay over. Who doesn't want to have a paranormal experience in their life or the possibility of one? And this is another reason why bed and breakfast is safe to paranormal explorers, for example, that come to our bed and breakfast and you may see our resident ghost. So I know a lot of people that travel around, especially New England, looking for that ghost. They end up finding Stephen King.
So what's the question?
So I guess what I'm asking is this part and parcel to some of your research, because I feel that oral history sometimes get lost in favor of academic history, because you can't prove this. I mean, it's oral history, right? It's like what the natives bring to us. They bring us oral history. Is that part of your, how do you discern between the two?
I'll say it again, it could be a whole nother dissertation about oral history. I love oral history as a public historian. I've done a lot of oral history. I actually recorded some oral history of former wardens, guards, nurses, parole officers at the penitentiary. During my 3rd year, I was giving kind of like a grant scholarship to be able to study that for a summer and produce some video about that. We early on in this project talked about the potential of oral history, but I would have to go through the research ethics board at Queen's University, which is a process in of itself and does not favor oral history and understand history in the same way that they're understanding that they can destroy records or anonymize certain things about if they're doing like a psychological kind of experiment. And I faced that doing the oral history of the penitentiary. And we decided that perhaps it's kind of like, maybe it's another project. Maybe it's an article that I write later. Maybe it's another book, but it's not for this project. Though I will say, I do wish they used to bring paranormal investigators into the fort. They get to do Fort Henry, like the Fort Fright at Fort Henry, and then stay overnight. And I wish they would do that again because I'd do it in a heartbeat.
My name is Michael Dwyer. I've just joined this Learned Society. I'm the curator of the Princess of Wales Lone Regiment Museum. I teach history at RMC, and I'm a Montrealer. I think I should admit that right off. And it's not true that Montrealers in Kingston are really living on eternal exile. It's not true. My question, Ms. MacDonald, thank you very much for everything you've said to us this evening. We run a public history co-op program at the Armory for students in their senior year at RMC, and it's a public history course. And having done it 3 times now, I can't resist the feeling that there seems to be a conflict between the traditional historians and the public historians. And I'm wondering if that's true, first question. And it seems to me that delving into public history as we do, and using a museum and its artifacts to project a lesson, takes some emphasis off that traditional requirement for archival history, for the interview, and for all the other things that make us traditional historians so special. Thank you.
Never thought I'd get to talk about academic history and public history. I will say the first day I entered my public history degree, we had a little it was like lunch and chat, meet the professors. They told us right off the bat, we are viewed as, I hate to say second-class citizens, it is a direct quote from a book of a public historian. We are looked down upon by academic historians because they perhaps don't see the value in, and I'm not saying this is for all academic historians, I'm just based off what they were telling us in our kind of first day. They don't see the value of what we are doing. Perhaps they want to kind of keep it. They believe it should be kind of academic with intra-academic, and I'm very much make history accessible to everyone. Everyone has the right to kind of enjoy history. So yes, there is pushback. I get pushback every day as a public historian, kind of wanting to use the sources that I do. But I promise you, as a public historian, my footnotes, you'll never find better footnotes. I got a good footnotes. I got a good bibliography. And I think as somebody who's kind of done, I'm glad people laugh at that. As someone who's done a traditional kind of academic history degree and also a public history degree, I have gained valuable skills and developed skills and fostered a love between both that I think just kind of make me a good historian. And I think there's value in, of course, kind of our traditional understanding of the archives and footnotes and all that sort of stuff. But I think traditional academic historians can also learn a lot from kind of this public history, what public history brings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dolby, for your first. Jennifer McHenry has a question.
Jennifer, please unmute and give us your question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm sort of repeating what you were getting at, I think, concerning the penitentiary, but I'd also like to apply it to the asylum. That is tourism and certain interpretations trivialize the people who were held in these institutions. And that is, to my mind, very upsetting. An example of that is the Kingston Week Standard a number of years ago got in touch with me about the asylum and wanted to do an interview on the site. I have to admit, it went right over my head that it was late October when they were interviewing me. And I discovered that despite the fact that I had done an academic interpretation of the asylum, plus knowing from personal experience some of the people who had been institutionalized there, they were looking for ghosts. And the reporter got so frustrated with me, he said when we were walking around the back of the asylum, well, Jennifer, what would you think if you looked up there and you saw a light going past the windows upstairs in the darkness? And I said, hey, excuse me, but why would a ghost need a light? So that kind of ended the interview. But, you know, when you think of the asylum since the 1850s, that people were taken away from their parents, from their relatives. They were brought into this huge stone building where they were minimalized as human beings, despite the fact the theories behind asylums with people like Dr. Kirkbride were actually, some aspects of them were fairly okay. But that's not how it turned out. People were treated cruelly. So I just leave it with that. Thank you.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I have so many stories I could also tell about my experiences taking the tours at the asylum. I just saw Kingston Penitentiary again when I get asked for interviews a lot during the Halloween season, and I remember actually, Duncan, you forwarded me information from somebody from CKWS, and I did do that interview. And I had briefly just mentioned Rockwood as a site that I kind of studied. You're like, oh, tell me a ghost story from Rockwood. I was like, we don't have time. You do not have time to air a segment of me talking about maybe why we shouldn't do that. It's very complex. It's very multifaceted. We do not have time to do that. And so we just talked about kind of McBurney Park instead because we filmed it there. But it is something I talk a lot more and we'll be talking a lot more about in my dissertation. But thank you for sharing that and knowing that I'm not alone in any of that.
Questions? Thank you, Jennifer. I might just throw one out as well. I've written a great deal of books on Bermuda and its very successful tourism industry. That industry for over a century has rested on a very broadly held myth projected through the schools, through the newspapers, that Bermuda is British, it's deferential, it's pleasant, it's not the United States. And it's worked very, very well for them. Similarly, I've written a history of Queens, which is a very conservative institution, a very fine institution. But Queens has rested on tradition tremendously as a sort of justification about what it is, that Presbyterian myth rolling into the 20th century, et cetera. Is there a danger in all of this that these tours, the narratives you have, could become instruments of social control?
That's a really big question. I feel like technically, yes. I think any kind of narrative could turn into a kind of myth that can be used. I know a lot of times people talk about Kingston as being a very British city, and it is a very British city, but I am currently a teaching assistant for a course. It's an undergraduate course on the cultural history of Kingston. That's kind of trying to reframe it as also thinking that we're actually also very American. And we often, as Kingstonians, as Canadians, also try to kind of distance ourselves from what's happening in the States. But this professor is actively trying to show that, you know, this is American tradition, but it's also just kind of Canadian tradition at the end of the day. So, I mean, technically, yes, I haven't come across that yet. I don't know if I'll have time and space in my dissertation to look at that, but it's something that I do think about a lot when I do kind of look at these narratives.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, Pat, obviously the questions and the attention you've had have shown us that you're really onto some very interesting doctoral work. At some point, as your supervisor will tell you, you've got to cut it short. Yep. This is an academic exercise to prove your skills, etc. And your skill set is different, as you pointed out. The book lies beyond that horizon. Not only a book for you, see, I'm sounding very orthodox here, but the kind of world of public history is there for you. And that is much more challenging and rewarding, I think. So on behalf of us, we wish you good luck. And we look forward to your publication in Historic Kingston. So thank you very much.
On behalf of thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to
All the pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. I'll draw your attention to the first lecture we have in January of next year, Wednesday, the 17th of January. This will be in Limelight. You'll pick it up there and on our website, when we will have another Queen's historian, Professor Gordon Dewick, will come and talk about his research into the Black experience in Kingston, something that's been pretty much on the margins of Kingston. He'll be looking at Black music, the minstrel tradition, etc. So that's on the 17th of January. We'll be in Limelight, and we look forward to seeing you. And as you might sense, that is a kind of precursor for Black History Month in Kingston and in Canada next year. So wish you all a happy Christmas, and we'll see you next year. Thank you.